Shamans and medicine people. Do they still exist, and where can you find them? Every now and then someone calls me asking how to find a shaman or medicine man or woman. I try to be of assistance, yet those who truly possess these capabilities are rare in our time. And that rarity is why discernment matters. It's also why I wrote this in-depth article and why I'm filming this video now. I'm Ben, Oofana, completing another of a series of articles. I've had a lot of travel in the past week and the weeks to come. And so with this window of time, I am batch filming a few videos. Definitely not perfection here, but let's dive into it. Also, because I include so much depth and detail in my articles, like so many journalists and academics, I will be reading from the article itself because there's a lot of detail I want to make sure I will include, and it's way more than I could remember. So with that, let's dive in. From early childhood, I was drawn to Native Americans, and when I learned about the traditional Native doctors at the age of 14, the medicine men and women, the vision quests, the visionary experiences, the powers they possessed, I decided that if ever given the opportunity, this is what I'm going to do with my life. At 17, I took off on my own. I was living in Southeast Texas, but I was saving money, making plans, and I had a car, and I just hauled ass out of Texas. And I made it as far as Oklahoma, landed in a community of predominantly Kiowa Indians. And right off, I just immersed myself in the local Native culture. I was in the powwows and going to peyote meetings, sitting up all night with the Native elders. And it was in one of these meetings that I met the man who was to become my mentor, Horace Daukei. He's one of the last surviving traditional doctors among the Kiowa tribe. I will be reiterating a few details from a recent video, but it's important, though, in case you heard the other one, you need the context for this video as well. Anyway, when I was introduced to Horace, he didn't have much to say in the beginning, yet he tended to be very quiet and introspective after the peyote meetings. And the following winter, this elderly Kiowa man that I had grown close to asked Horace to conduct a special peyote meeting for his grandson who was suffering from some kind of rare blood disorder. I was afraid they wouldn't let me in because Kiowa and other tribes often didn't let non-Native folks come into the meetings. I remember that night before the meeting, I was talking with a younger friend of mine, and Horace was across the hallway in another bedroom talking to this elderly man, Jack, and he stopped and stared at me with this intent look. I felt the chills go through my body. In hindsight, looking back, I think he knew at that moment that I would, in time, become his apprentice. At sunset, we entered the teepee, we took our seats, and sometime after midnight, Horace began to work with his patient. He first covered the body of his patient with a black silk handkerchief, and Horace, like so many of the traditional Native doctors over the centuries, possessed paranormal abilities. He took a live piece of charcoal from the fire, put it into his mouth, and he's blowing, and you see the sparks flying from his mouth as he does so. And then at a certain point, he reaches down to the ground, and he takes a mold that he had come out of the ground, sets it onto his patient, and somehow it's helping to facilitate the healing process. Now, I know that's a stretch for a lot of people in our modern day world who have never had any interaction with Indigenous peoples. I first heard about these things when I was in my teens. I would spend hours and hours in the university library near to where I lived, and there were all these books written maybe 1860s up through maybe 1940s, and a lot of anthropologists and other people who lived with the various Native American tribes would relate these accounts of the Native doctors and other individuals who possessed these extraordinary gifts and healing powers. And the fact that I've spent time in India, Sri Lanka, China, I've been around people of different cultures who possess these different gifts and capabilities. it's made me realize that what we consider the normal human range of capabilities is only just a very narrow slice of what humans are actually capable of. So I do encourage you to keep your mind open, and if you ever have the opportunity, do step out of the bubble you're living in and go spend time among indigenous peoples or in some of the other ancient traditional cultures. Anyway, I was so blown away watching Horace work. Is something that I had wanted to see for so long. And then I was caught up in life at that time. I was in college. I was into my second year, and my grades were starting to go down by that point. And I think at some level, I realized I wasn't really doing what I needed to be doing with my life. And after speaking with a few friends, I decided I would approach Horace and ask him if he would take me on as an apprentice. And I was terrified at first because I was afraid he would say to me, like, well, these kinds of powers only work for people who are born native. And a lot of the native people at the time, and I assume still do, held the belief that these kinds of healing gifts, the powers that were passed down through the centuries, what they call medicine, many of them hold the belief that it only works for native people. So I was terrified that Horace would say, like, I can't teach you these things. And I was going by his cousin's house, and the cousin would blow me off. And yet the cousin told Horace, this white kid keeps stopping by, and he's asking for you. And Horace said to him, when he comes by again, I want to speak to him. So he came out, he sat in the car with me, and I'm physically shaking because I was so afraid he would turn me down. And best I could, the words came out of my mouth, and I'm saying, I want to learn to do what you're doing. And he looked back and he says, what are you doing this weekend? Can you start fasting? And still shaking, I'm like, yeah, sure. And he has me drive down into the Wichita Mountains. I'm sitting in my car, fasting with no food or water the next 2 days and nights. And then he instructed me to meet him the following Sunday at a peyote meeting that he was conducting. So I did, and we spoke. And he told me afterwards to, when you finish your semester, come on out to where I'm living on the Navajo reservation with my wife, and you can stay with me. We'll get started. And so I started making plans from that point. And then a couple of months later, as soon as the semester was over, I put everything I had in storage, just took enough with me, just basic essentials, and headed on out to New Mexico. Everything about my apprenticeship with Horace was intense. From the beginning, he had me going along with him, assisting him as he would work with his patients. And then all along the way, he would be at different times taking objects such as, say, the end of a feather and seeding it with his power. And this is a traditional way that these doctors would transmit their power. He'd project that into my body. Whenever you do that, it sounded like a gun with a silencer going off. And I'd feel this tremendous force hitting me, and it would knock me unconscious briefly. Fortunately, I had someone standing behind to catch me, so I didn't just fall back and split my head open or something. But I would feel afterwards, I'd feel this presence, this power working within my body. And then when you receive these gifts of healing, what they refer to as medicine, you can't just take the medicine and run with the ball. They say it doesn't quite work for you if you do. You have to earn the right to work with it. And so Horace would have me go through the vision quest. Typically, the vision quest entails going out alone in the mountains or maybe the desert, depending on where you're living or happen to be, and fasting the 4 days and nights, as I said, without food, without water. Now, as I progressed in my healing, Horace had me take on a more active role. He would actually have me assisting him as he would work with his patients. One of the instances that stands out most to me is when Horace had me assist him with a man who was left paralyzed from the waist down when a front-end loader that he was operating turned over and he was pinned underneath. Horace had me using this technique, using suction, in that instance, actually drawing the blood clots out of the back of this man's leg. And I was in absolute shock seeing the blood clots come out from the back of this man's leg. And it's like, holy shit, it actually worked. And yet I was still very afraid. I didn't doubt it. Can I do anything? Do I know enough? What if I hurt somebody? And yeah, Horace was steadily, calmly persistent with me and said, you have the medicine. You have these gifts. You just need to start working with people. I cannot explain everything you need to do. This power is going to work differently for you than it does for me. Just start working with people. The power is going to reveal itself to you. There are other aspects of the training as well. Horace expected me to know how to survive, to use my instincts. And at one point, he dumped me off in the middle of the Hopi Indian Reservation with $30 in my backpack, with the instructions, make it the best you can. He just said, find whatever work you can and just do the best you can to survive. And a few months later, after I'd found work, doing what I could to get by, Horace showed up and he just says, ready to go. And I quickly grabbed my belongings and loaded up, and we were back on the road again. For nearly 3 years, I trained with Horace, who is still to this day the most powerful of any healer I have ever known or even heard of. Like, I've worked with some extraordinarily gifted healers, and I've heard accounts from other people that I know who have spent time in Brazil and other parts of the world. But especially when it came to assisting people with a wide range of physical health-related issues, Horace was extraordinarily powerful. Yet, despite the power that Horace possessed, the extraordinary gifts of healing, Horace had never learned how to work effectively with his own emotions and to heal his own traumatic wounding. Therefore, the traumas that he carried from his own childhood had not healed. There was a recklessness about Horace, and toward the end of the time that I was apprenticing with him, he started becoming destructive and not knowing what else to do. I was in my early 20s at the time, and seeing Horace starting to act out, as I said, become rather destructive, I severed ties. For me, that was devastating, because from the time I was 14, as I said, I had this dream of training with the powerful native doctor and following this path, and yet I felt all this was coming unraveled on me. I was flailing on my own for some time. And as I began to work with people on my own, especially, it took me some time to work into it, but all those traumas of my own childhood and adolescence, in the early stages, in the beginning, it was like pouring hydrogen peroxide into an infected wound. As that trauma was coming out, I found myself reenacting those traumas in my attempts to form romantic or intimate relationships, and the pain I felt at times was excruciating or debilitating. I was really struggling there. But it led me to develop a whole system of intensive meditation practices that awaken the innate healing intelligence residing within the body and mind. And in addition, I realized that I needed more. I couldn't do it all on my own, and so I started exploring any therapeutic intervention that held promise. And I continued, and still do to this day, with those interventions that I have found to be most effective. And then in 1993, I started returning to the Wichita Mountains, going back to the mountains to do the Vision Quest. Again, the 4 days and nights to fast without food and water. And I have been returning every year in the spring and fall since that time. Now, going back a bit, backtracking here, shortly after arriving in Oklahoma, a friend of mine, Steve, introduced me to his adoptive father. Steve and I were just about the same age, And his father, Jack, adoptive father, was in charge of the Kiowa chapter of the Native American Church. And while I was talking with Steve, I was telling him how much I wanted to go into the peyote meetings. I'm still 17 at the time. I had just arrived in Oklahoma. I don't know if I'd even been there a month. And so Steve says to Jack, his adoptive father, he says, "Hey, Dad, Ben wants to go into the peyote meetings." And Jack thought for a second, said, "Okay, just let me go in." Normally, the Kiowa people and a lot of other Native folks didn't allow non-Natives to go into the peyote meetings, but for some reason, Jack made an exception for me. He did receive some pushback later on from other Kiowa elders, but Jack was very firm with them, and he said, "This one is different. Let him come in." The other Kiowa elders deferred to his authority. Now, over time, the other Kiowa elders warmed up to me, and I would talk with them. I would spend a good bit of time with them as well, especially after the peyote meetings. Initially, I struggled in the peyote meetings. My butt hurt, my back ached, sitting up on a cushion, cross-legged, the whole night. And the most difficult part, it was really difficult to stay awake all night. If I ate enough peyote is a little anesthetizing. You don't feel the pain in your body, but if I ate enough peyote, I would get incredibly nauseous and vomit, which wasn't too fun. And some of the Kiowa folks, as much as they like to gossip, they would be talking among themselves about me throwing up in the meetings. But intuitively, I learned. I figured things out on my own. It's like, well, I needed to start ingesting the peyote maybe in the afternoon or 12 noon or something. And if I did so, it gave my body time to acclimate so I could gradually continue to ingest the peyote. And by the time we went into the meetings, I was fine. I would go into such extraordinary deep states. I would have these visionary experiences in the peyote meetings. It was extraordinarily powerful, gained a lot of insight, everything. And yeah, it was wonderful, but I could eat lots of peyote at that point. I think it must have been a real head trip, too, for a lot of these Native elders. Here I was, this white kid, showed up at that time. At first I was 17, going on 18, up into my early 20s when I was there living among the Kiowa. A lot of my peers from high school and when I went on to college, they didn't give a shit about any of this stuff. I mean, they were out running around, partying, watching television, doing all the things that teens do. And here I am sitting up in the peyote meeting all night with these Native elders. And but for me, that's what I wanted to do. There's nothing else that I really felt drawn to at that point. I was so drawn to these traditional practices. And at times, even some of my peers, some of the younger Native folks that I would spend time with, they would just look at me and say, "Damn, you're more Native than we are." It wasn't too long afterwards that my friend Steve, who first introduced me to his father, Jack, after he had joined the Army and went through basic training, and then they sent him off to Germany. After that, I ended up spending enormous amounts of time with his father, Jack. And here I was in my late teens, 17, then 18, and 19, 20. Jack's health was declining. I would occasionally go into meetings with him, but I would go over many evenings when he needed help. I would help with mowing the lawn and other things he needed doing around the house. But I spent many evenings around the kitchen table with him, and he would share these accounts of his own life experience, of his own Kiowa people and their history. But what fascinated me the most were the stories Jack shared with me about the traditional Kiowa doctors, the medicine men and women, the paranormal abilities they possessed. Yet Jack also held these views that were common among his own Kiowa people, say other Native people as well, that this medicine power only works for those who are born Native. And that's part of the reason I disappeared. when I went off to apprentice with Horace because I was afraid. I didn't want anybody telling me what I couldn't do. I took off with Horace right after finishing my sophomore year of college. And the last time I ever saw Jack, I was with Horace. We stopped by his house. At one point, Jack looked at me very empathetically and looking directly into my eyes, and he was saying, "We miss you." And at that point, I was so dissociated. I was still carrying a lot of trauma from my childhood and adolescence. So I was very disconnected. So it didn't fully register with me at the time. I wasn't grasping the significance of how important of a person that he is to me in my life. And even to this day, I still miss him. There are times when, especially when I've been on the vision quest, I'd be on the mountain, I'd be thinking of him. I'd wish so many times that I could go back or I could meet him some way and just share with him all I've experienced over the years and get his perspective on what I've experienced, what I've gone through, and hear whatever insights that he would have to share with me. In times past, there were many extraordinarily powerful native doctors, many possessing paranormal abilities. Some could extract fluid from the lungs of a person suffering from pneumonia. Pneumonia was very prevalent in centuries past because you had all these native folks. They could be out in the wild in inclement weather, and they were just caught out there, no shelter. But they were able to use that suction and draw the fluid out of the person's lungs. There were certain individuals, some of these native doctors that had a special gift or power, this medicine. They could extract a bullet or arrow, say somebody was wounded in battle, and within minutes they could seal the open wound. There were others that had the ability, say in times of drought, they could draw the rain. Are some that had the ability, say if a tornado was approaching, they would walk in the direction of the tornado, they would start saying these prayers or chants, the tornado would veer off in another direction. And there were those individuals that had what was referred to as war medicine. And there were numerous accounts that I heard from different native elders, and also in some of the books that were published, like I said, from back in late 1860s on. Some of those anthropologists and others who spent time among the native people were recounting some of these individuals who possessed that power. They would go flying into the midst of the battle and people would shoot at them. Accounts in some instances where some of them, they'd wear those war bonnets, and many of the feathers were clipped. The feathers in the war bonnet were shot out, and yet that warrior, it didn't have a scratch on their body. Now, in addition to hearing the accounts that Jack shared with me, it was common for these native Kiowa elders, after the peyote meetings, when they were sitting or lying around in the morning, when they were resting, and they would be sharing their own accounts that had been passed down through the generations from their own parents and grandparents, as well as many of them had witnessed some of these miraculous healings from the doctors who were still alive, that were still holding on. When they were young men or women, or when they were children, they were seeing some of these things that had taken place. What really saddens me, though, is how much has been lost over the decades. Many of the Plains tribes around from 1860s, 70s, 80s, that's when they were basically herding everyone onto the reservations. It's when the last of the hostilities, the fighting between the tribes and the cavalry, when all that was winding down. And those who survived the massacres and survived the smallpox, measles, or other epidemics, it's when they were all pushed onto reservations. Adding to it, the native children from that time were taken from their families and forced to attend government and church-run boarding schools, and sometimes thousands of miles away from home. In many instances, they were beaten for speaking their native languages. They were shamed and humiliated for their heritage. They were subjected to verbal, physical, even sexual abuse. Some of these children died in these, what they call the residential schools. I get the impression that even more so in Canada. There were many instances where there were numerous graves around some of these schools, and so a lot of these children never made it back to their families. Many of the children who did return, once they returned to their own people, they wanted nothing to do with their own traditional practices. They just wanted to forget, move on, assimilate somehow into the dominant culture. Also, the United States government forbade Native people from practicing the Sundance and other ritual practices, so Native communities took these practices underground. There were instances where the agent, I guess from the Bureau of Indian Affairs or tribal agent for a given tribe would say, hey, if you try to do the Sundance, we'll bring in the troops and we'll massacre whoever's there. So having suffered as much as they have and having lost so many of their own people, it's like, okay, it's not worth it to get a whole bunch more of us killed. So whatever they had left, they just took it underground. Many of the Native doctors, over the decades, as they were getting towards the end of their life, they were realizing that the profound gifts of healing that they possessed, the medicine, that unless they were able to pass it on, that these gifts, these powers would be lost forever. So they wanted desperately to find a younger apprentice that they could pass it on to. Sadly, many of these doctors had no one that they could transmit the medicine to. So what happened? They took it to the grave with them. So much was lost. Another issue is that many in the younger generations were not willing to undergo the Vision Quest or Sundance, both which involve fasting the 4 days and nights without food and water, or take part in other intensive ritual practices. They were not willing to accept the responsibility of carrying these medicine powers, and many of them just wanted to enjoy the comforts of modern day life. They wanted to assimilate. Consequently, so much of the beauty and power that was once an integral part of Native life has died out. Presently, there are very few Native doctors left. You can still find some among some of the Western tribes, maybe the Lakota, the Navajo, a few other tribes you might find in places like Arizona, Montana. Yet, my sense of it is that they're nowhere near as powerful as the doctors in decades and centuries past. A few years ago, I saw a man who had suffered severe head trauma as a result of a vicious assault. And he had been treated by a Lakota doctor, but didn't see much improvement. I looked at him, he looked horrible, and I had just one opportunity to work with him because he was in New York for a very short period of time, and yet after that one session he showed significant improvement, and he indicated such to me as well. Sadly, so many of these Native doctors, powerful medicine, other gifts of healing, the extraordinary powers and capabilities they possess, the wisdom, the knowledge, so much of that is gone now. It's no longer here. There's no one that I know of who really possesses a lot of this. And it saddens me because when I go out in areas, I'm around Native people, and you see these people and I feel everyone's pretty much doing the best they can to get through life, but it's the people nowadays, and I like a lot of these people. I care about them. I have connections with them, but they're not like their grandparents or great-grandparents in the generations past. They're like a whole different people in a sense. And as I said, so much of what the Native people possessed for hundreds, thousands of years, so much of that is gone into our present-day world. And now we have this whole new agey, there's weekend workshops and people who are becoming instant healers or instant shamans. One of the things I hate the most about New Age spirituality is how it trivializes and commercializes ancient spiritual traditions and practices. And the reason that happens is because here we are, we've grown up in this modern day Western culture with all these conveniences and technologies, and yet we haven't had any real exposure to indigenous peoples of other ancient cultures where these traditions and practices were carried on over thousands of years. And so basically we have no real point of reference or understanding what it's about. And so people have, as I said, commercialized, they've invented all kinds of things. And a lot of folks in our modern day world, not knowing any better, it's like, oh, I can go take these workshops and now I'm a master healer, or go through whatever few weeks or weekend or whatever, now they're a shaman. And I see people doing that, and yet it is so profoundly ignorant and misguided. The fact is, people offering these trainings and the ones taking them, they do not possess any real power or capability. And to be honest, coming from my background, having trained from a traditional native doctor, having interacted with people of other traditions as well, who possess extraordinary powers and capabilities, I find that incredibly offensive. And I have said to people at times, stop calling yourself a shaman. Stop calling yourself a healer, because you're not. You're really no different than a child playing with a toy stethoscope. I've asked people on many occasions, how would you feel if you needed the intervention of a dentist? You needed dental surgery or some other critical medical intervention, and you find out your dentist or your physician had 3 weekends of training. Native Americans and other indigenous peoples knew who their traditional doctors were and understood the powers they possessed, because these things had been a part of their cultures for thousands of years. The problem is that most people in our modern world have never had any contact with traditional native doctors or with the depths of other ancient spiritual traditions who actually possess these powers. And that's why people today have absolutely no point of reference. In fact, many traditional native doctors would literally scare the shit out of most people nowadays. These individuals operate on a completely different plane and possess extraordinary abilities, and those powers would trigger people who are not used to them. In every ancient tradition I'm familiar with, becoming a healer is an extraordinarily arduous process, a years-long process. In the tradition I trained in, you typically apprentice with an older doctor toward the end of his or her life, who transmits all or a portion of the power, the medicine they possess to you. You're then expected to go on the vision quest, where you're fasting the 4 days and nights alone in the mountains without food and water, to earn the right to work with these gifts of healing. And if you're truly serious, you'll keep going through the vision quest. Traditional native doctors and other indigenous healers typically take on one or at most a few apprentices over the course of their lives. They certainly don't accept whoever shows up with the money. Passing the medicine on to too many people dilutes the power, and it pollutes the lineage. So when people ask me how to become a healer, a shaman, a medicine person, I tell them, forget about the weekend workshop bullshit. Go to the parts of the world where these indigenous healers still exist. If you were studying modern medicine, very likely you'd be relocating to attend medical school, unless that school happened to be in the city where you lived. And you'd be dedicating years of your life to rigorous training. Similarly, if you want to become a healer, you'll probably need to live with or be in close proximity to the doctor for years. That's the path, not weekends and a certificate. Sadly, as I've pointed out, so much of these spiritual traditions, and the practices, and the extraordinary gifts in healing and other powers are being lost or are already gone. There are still some intact traditions and places in the world where they exist, although even these are being diluted. In India, for instance, many within the Hindu Vedic tradition still carry a great deal of knowledge and power. Even there, many of the gurus are not what they once were. Too many are now embroiled in corruption and scandals, and much of it feels cultish. The Tibetans have suffered enormous upheaval and trauma with China's occupation of Tibet and the forced exile from their homeland. Yet, in many respects, they've maintained the integrity of their spiritual tradition. Some teachings probably are diluted to make them more accessible or palatable to Western followers, but they still have a great deal to offer and provide a viable path for those who genuinely want to grow spiritually. As for medicine men and women or shamans, you may still find some among certain Western tribes such as the Lakota or Navajo, but it's probably not going to work for you to just show up and say, I want to be your apprentice. Will you teach me? You'll probably need to live in the community or at least spend significant amounts of time there. You'll need to actually build relationships, a process that takes time. It's also important to be on the ground, become intimately familiar with the culture, the practices, and the people involved so you know what you're dealing with. You may find others in some of the more remote tribal communities in Canada, although these practices are dying out there as well. Many of the indigenous tribes in parts of Brazil, Ecuador, and other South American nations have been able to maintain their culture, traditions, and practices much longer because of their limited exposure to Western influence, although that is changing rapidly. Some communities, though, actively defend their lands, and outsiders who trespass can be harmed or worse, killed. Just as serious, uncontacted or minimally contacted tribes are highly vulnerable to common illnesses. Pathogens like measles or influenza can be deadly. In many regions, contact is restricted or illegal for exactly these reasons. Brazil does have a long tradition of gifted non-indigenous healers, particularly in regions such as Bahia. The Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia have long established healing traditions as well. Many of them are extraordinarily powerful. The use of ayahuasca and other hallucinogens has become increasingly popular in recent years. You may have powerful visionary experiences, but you're not going to develop the extraordinary powers or gifts of healing from attending these ceremonies. In Mexico, tribes have for centuries been using the hallucinogenic psilocybin mushrooms, yet I haven't heard of any truly powerful healers. You can go yourself if you want. You may find somebody. Not only has ayahuasca and other plant medicine ceremonies become commonplace, they have also become a huge money-making business, running into the hundreds or even thousands of dollars a pop. I never paid money when I attended peyote meetings. I brought food, helped gather firewood, and helped set up the teepee. That's about it. Another important consideration is when you ingest a substance like ayahuasca, your natural protective boundaries come down. You're more open, more permeable. In small enclosed spaces, that permeability matters. If someone in that circle drinks heavily, uses other drugs, mistreats animals, children, or anyone for that matter, is manipulative, chronically dishonest, or is otherwise dysfunctional or toxic, acutely or chronically physically ill, are experiencing psychiatric issues, you're more likely to take on their garbage. There are shamans among the Hmong and indigenous groups of Southeast Asia and among the indigenous peoples of Siberia. I don't know much about the healing traditions across Africa, but I am open should I encounter or get a good feeling from any of these individuals. It's good to be open and get out of the bubbles that so many of us are living in to explore what's out there, but I do want to offer a word of caution because in so many parts of the world where people are living in poverty and the locals see no viable path forward, there can be a serious risk of robbery, assault, kidnapping for ransom, and even murder. You need to keep your radar up at all times. And for women, there's even greater reason for caution. Just because someone possesses power doesn't mean they have good boundaries or good intentions. Some use their power to seduce younger, attractive women. And among certain South American shamans, there's a tendency to play on both sides of the fence. They may use their power to facilitate healing and yet also to inflict harm. That said, there are wonderful experiences to be had. Traveling to these places and working with truly powerful healers can open whole new worlds for you. As I learned living among the Kiowa and the Navajo, keep your eyes open, your back to the wall, and tune into your intuition. Vet the people you encounter through community, move slowly, and set clear boundaries. Listen to your gut. When it says yes, take the next step. If you still have questions and want to pursue working with the healer, or even to become one yourself, you're welcome to reach out. I'll share what I can, but please keep in mind that I work very long hours. If you're asking for guidance outside of a session, that's time away from the work I do to support myself, so please consider making a donation. Having trained with the traditional native doctor of the Kiowa tribe and gone through so many vision quests, I work as a conduit, allowing an extraordinarily powerful presence to move through me to facilitate healing within the body and mind. These sessions are especially helpful for people dealing with anxiety and depression and trauma and going through a breakup or divorce or struggling with attachment issues. They also address a wide range of physical health-related concerns, including digestive and respiratory issues, sports injuries, and injuries from automobile accidents, including traumatic brain injuries. To learn more or schedule a session, message or call 332-333-5155 or visit benoofana.com or teachmetomeditate.com.